Thanks for tuning in to Around the Coin. This is a amazing conversation I had over 2 hours long with Sean Moss-Pultz, the co-founder of Bitmark Inc. Bitmark is a startup working to extend traditional property rights to the digital age by creating tools that give individuals control over their digital assets and data. We talked about the three different products they're building to do this, Feral File, Autonomy, and Bitmark. That was at the end of the conversation. So if you're interested specifically in Bitmark Inc. and the tools that they're building, really, we didn't cover that until about an hour and 45 minutes in. The first hour and 45 minutes were parsing government structures, the changes in power across generations. Sean has read a lot of history and cites a lot of that in this conversation, which I find personally really educational and inspiring. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. My mind is blown. Sean was one of my favorite guests I've had on the podcast. Here is Sean Moss-Pultz. All right, Sean. I'm excited to chat with you, man. Yeah.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, likewise. I love that we were talking pre-show about Taiwan, Singapore, our time in Asia, building hardware, software. You identify yourself as a software guy. You've worked on different projects in software and hardware. What things have you worked on that you felt have been the most, the biggest learning experiences, the places where you really earned your stripes, so to speak, of the
Yeah. So when I went over to Asia, so this was back in 2004. So you have to kind of put yourself in pre-iPhone days. Phones, like the best phones were flip phones. Remember those things? I don't know.
Yeah.
Dating me. And I worked for this startup that was doing mobile phones, and we built our own protocol stack. So the whole software, the operating system, all the way up to the protocol layer, including the UI, everything, the hardware, software, everything from scratch. And it was a huge disaster. It never worked. It never got stable. And so I was ready to go home. That was like 3 years of just like blood, sweat, and tears. And I was ready to go home. And one of my good friends came and talked to me. And I was just complaining about how stupid I thought it was that we were building from scratch an operating system in 2000. And I think it was probably 5 at the time, when Linux was taking over the internet. And here we were building a real-time operating system, like all in C, all from scratch, all crazy. And I said, somebody should just put Linux on a phone, and that would be a great experience. And so he told me, well, why don't you do it? And I'm like, I don't know how to do that kind of thing. And he's like, if I gave you a bit of money and taught you how to start a company, would you want to do it? Like he said, would you know how to do it technically? And I said, I can do it technically, but I don't know anything else about that sort of thing. I was a software engineer purely, and didn't know about managing larger teams, didn't know about managing, of course, supply chains and things like that. So I jumped in the deep end. Kind of long story short, we totally went for it. And it was a crazy rabbit hole.
To what scale did this is Openmoko?
This is Openmoko. So yeah, it was, the original idea was that we would take some existing hardware. And so one of the investors, they were a hardware manufacturer, and they had a smartphone. And the smartphone was going to run Windows, a version of Windows back then that Microsoft was working on. And so the original idea was that I convinced them to sell me that hardware, and then we would just do a Linux port for it. Quickly realized that it's impossible to put Linux on any kind of complex system if you don't have the data sheets of how the it's called an SoC, a system on a chip. If you don't have the data sheets of how that works, you just can't do it. The power management, the way you talk to the peripherals, the GSM systems, all that stuff, you can't do it. You just need data sheets. And so that took me to meet Samsung in Korea and convince them to open up the data sheets for us. And then that got deeper and deeper. We ended up building our own phone, complete, like open schematics, everything. We shipped about 250,000 of these phones in 2006. Got the entire Linux system to work. A lot of code. Kind of a fun aside. When Android was being developed, they were using our phone because it was the only phone that actually could run an open source version of Linux at the time. So yeah,
Wow.
we were about 85 people at the peak. Yeah.
Wow. And you're shipping 250,000. I mean, I think of 85 as being like a team of Spartans to be able to handle that much. Like you're building across the stack of hardware. I guess you're using existing hardware, but still
No, that one we did our own hardware. So, I mean, it was just like one disaster after another. So there was all of these completely wrong assumptions. So the first assumption was that we could just use somebody else's hardware and develop software for it. And then the second assumption was that we could use somebody else's hardware that wasn't in mass production and that we could actually, and the person that was going to mass produce that phone, they were a laptop manufacturer. The other wrong assumption is that, well, to manufacture a laptop is the same to manufacture a phone. So we ended up having to build out like the whole production team. We had to redo all the hardware from scratch. So yeah, I think we had about 25 on the software side, about 30 on the hardware side, about 10 that were on manufacturing. And so it gives you an idea of like how we thought about sort of sales and marketing. It's basically a zero.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it almost has to be at that scale when so much of your resources go to just building and shipping products. How do you think about a company like Amazon who went for the phone? I think they spent north of like 700 million, if my memory serves me. Like they spent a lot on the phone, and it was a flop. And Bezos will say, "Hey, it was worth trying, but it didn't work." Do you view? Is there at this point? Is it just a closed? Like, does Apple have just such a lock on it, or how do you view the current landscape of mobile and maybe where it's going?
Yeah, I'll start by a story so I did actually shut down Openmoko, and the story was there was this transition from 2.5G to 3G. And so Qualcomm, they own almost all of the IPR, the main patents of 3G. And so just to be able to do a design of a 3G phone, you had to give them $5 million just to like sign up. And this was $5 million in 2007, 2008. That was a lot. I mean, $5 million then was a lot of money. And that wasn't even the manufacturing side. Like, to be able to do the high speed stuff, which is what was required for 3G, you needed a lot more equipment. We felt that we needed to raise at least 20 million to have any chance whatsoever of manufacturing a 3G phone. And so it quickly became clear that like you needed hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to do a phone. I don't know if you remember Andy Rubin when he left Google. I don't know, whatever the verb is there. When he left Google, he did a phone, and I think they raised 200 million. My numbers could be slightly wrong there. I mean, this is the person that did Android, so he knew more about operating systems and phones than probably anybody at that point, and that was a failure. And so, for better or worse, it really feels like we're in this world where you have two major platforms, and the supply chains of these phones are so vertically integrated now that for startups to come in, I feel like there needs to be some fundamental shift in the hardware or the software, or it's just not possible. Maybe we can do software radios, so you don't have to pay all of the IPR to Qualcomm. You don't have to. I don't know. It just seems like it's insurmountable right now. Everybody's entrenched, and there's no way to get in with it, even with a lot of money.
And the vertical integration serves as a moat. So it's like Apple has ownership over start to finish, from design, build, manufacturing, distribution. So because they're vertically integrated on that stack, none of that technological advancement is available for other people to leverage. It's not like there's a service provider that will build your phone, the same way like AWS will just host your website. Like Amazon's
right.
brilliance was like, let's offer to the world what we built internally. And Apple's, effective strategy was keep internally what we've developed so then we can charge a lot of money for it and build something better than anyone else.
Yeah, and it's even more extreme in many ways than that. So being in Asia, we know all of the suppliers that are making the parts that the iPhone use. And we would go to them and we would say, hey, we want to use that touchscreen because that touchscreen's great. So we want to use that kind of touchscreen as well. And they say, no, we have an exclusive with Apple. Or they'll say, okay, you need to guarantee to commit to 1 million units a month. Right. And just if you look at the cash flows of what it costs to run that kind of business, you quickly realize that you have to have incredible forecasting. Like, I'm going to ship this much. If you ship too much, you'll die. If you don't ship that much, you'll die. So it's like you run into these situations where, there's just moats everywhere. And so back to the Amazon question for a moment. I think they were probably a little bit late, and they had to execute flawlessly. And because really what happened was at that time, the app stores were already pretty locked down. By that point, Google had this Play Services thing where if you wanted to use Android, which of course they were building the phone on Android as well, you had to comply with Google's Play Service requirements, and that required you use their app store. And so Amazon, of course, wants their own app store. And so when you do that, okay, now you have to rebuild that whole thing yourself. You can no longer use those components. So even though Android feels like it's this open source operating system, the things that the customers see and the customers want, like, can my Google Docs work on it, right? Or can I download Twitter from the Play Store? All of those kind of things. The answer is no if you don't run Google's certification program, which means Google has control over the device, which means you're really just making a Google phone for Google. So this is very, very, very tricky.
Yeah, I heard a quote from Bill Gates once where he said the reason, who knows how true this is, but he said the reason why the Windows Phone failed, which was, I think, the most serious competitor to the Google and Apple platforms, was because he was in the middle of a antitrust suit. The government is suing him for a monopoly on, I think, their operating system. And he spent so much time, the team spent so much time defending that, going to court, go to DC, like doing everything that requires. They didn't give as much attention to the phone, and it kind of like, it wasn't a flop. It was like it just didn't go far enough. It just was, I think, difficult to get, to your point, difficult to get all the developers to like rebuild on a new platform. And consumers get fatigue. Like, if you have quarter of your friends on one platform, quarter on the other, how do you integrate? How do you build out the development platforms with all the different apps? And I remember it's like, now there's tools that allow developers, at least in the early days, to build out on both platforms. Like Expo is one that comes to mind, where you can just build on one space and that'll port it over to the different operating systems. But even that's relatively new. Do you think in the future it'll become a explosion where we move away from the concept of like a physical hard device in your hand to maybe more of like a meta vision for the future, where it's like 3D immersive visual and I'm interacting with things using augmented reality, and that will eventually be the displacement of the mobile hardware concept?
I think that would be the only chance for us to get out of this Apple or Google App Store model. And if you look at this model, I feel like it's really run its course. Like, we're 10 something years in, probably more like 15 years in. And we get some innovation. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a bunch of really neat apps out there. There's apps that make my life a lot better, for sure. But we're really locked in this app paradigm. And there's just so much you can do with the phone. Like, the phone is a supercomputer, and it has all of these sensors that can be absolutely reacting to the environment around you. But all of that is locked off behind whatever business model Apple thinks makes sense for them. Right. And the only way that we get to this augmented reality where you have both kind of the social and the economic aspects of the real world, like really intersecting, really getting digitized in a way that I think you're alluding to here. I think the only way that works is if we do have a new hardware device, if we do have something that because these things go in cycles, like it's like a pendulum, right? Like there's the phone, because of the complexity of the electronics and the supply chain, and sort of the resistance to the commodification of all those things, allowed for a player like Apple to close everything off. The PC was just so commoditized that you got all of these different kind of wild stuff happening. The internet, all of that really happened because just the business model was different. And so, yeah, like my hope is that there is a new hardware, like there is a new type of hardware that comes out, and that would give a chance for like a radically different vision of the future than just apps. Yeah.
You ever watch a Silicon Valley TV show on Netflix where they have, I think
I watched the first couple. Yeah. And it's like, it was kind of like painful to watch because like at the time, I was starting a company, and it's like, you know how even in the jokes, there's enough truth that it can hurt sometimes.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. It's like the uncanny valley where you're like, we are cringe right now.
Yes.
They have at one point the introduction of the phone that's going to be the Pied Piper model, like what the kind of the show is centered around, is like decentralized internet. And it's like a sprinkle. I mean, it's comedy, drama, but it's also like a sprinkle of science fiction, because they're coming up with concepts that in the show you can elaborate on. Like Pied Piper is like the decentralized mobile internet that's going to it's going to build a whole new internet. And it's so big a vision that we laugh and also cringe, because you hear the same kind of grandiose visions in pitch decks. But the concept of this kind of centering or centralizing and then decentering or decentralizing is almost like, I view it as pendulums can go back and forth, but it's like a spiral goes up. So every version that we do, whether it's we centralize our society and everyone migrates to cities, or we decentralize and everyone moves into the suburbs or rural areas, there's now the game is not the same. Like, it's history rhymes, but it doesn't repeat itself. So then we now have the internet. So everything is different, even though we're decentralizing, generally moving away from cities, kind of sparked by COVID, but also the proliferation of the culture of remote work. And I think it affects everything. It affects that. There seems to be today a pattern of decentralizing across society, whether it's physical people, whether it's operating systems, ownership of everything from art to everything that there is on chain, documents and rights of any physical assets. And I try to digest what's the bigger pattern here, and how where we're going what are the implications for that? Like, how does government in some way become more decentralized? If it does, there seems to be a lot of like political agitation in the US around the governance model. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on that. I know you're involved on Furrow File, which is touching this in some way.
Sure. Yeah. I've thought about this a lot. And also, Taiwan is an interesting place because it's a democratic country, and they have a very, very interesting governance model. There's this project. I'll just give you kind of a little flavor of it, but there's this project I love. It's called Gov0, and the idea was, okay, how do you put almost like open source tools in the citizens' hands to participate in governance? And that was such an attractive force to me when I first got into. When I first understood Bitcoin, when I first understood Bitcoin, I thought it was nerd money. It could never work. And then when I looked at it again and really understood what was going on, it was everything that I loved about technology, in that it could be a force, a lever to organize people. in a way that they could do what they want to do with rules instead of rulers, right? And of course, going through that whole episode with the phone ecosystem and seeing how the Qualcomms, the Apples, the Googles have locked up what you could and could not do, both as a developer and as an end user. I felt this idea of an open, permissionless system was incredible, that you could have rules without rulers. I mean, that was the original idea of democracy, is that you could have a Bill of Rights, you could have a constitution, and citizens would participate and decide how they want to govern themselves. And so again, like the model before that was the kings and the queens, churches perhaps, and the model that we had was this model of democracy. And at the heart of democracy is the idea of rules instead of rulers, and the people that could speak those rules and operate in those rules and write those rules, well, they're lawyers, right? And my dad's a lawyer, so no offense about lawyers. I think of myself first and foremost as an engineer, but I really understand kind of the legal perspective. And I felt that when you could put some of the rules that would typically be in a legal system from a legal perspective, when you could put those in code, you could go global, you could go lower cost, you could go more inclusive, and then you could go permissionless, which is the best thing, right? Instead of having to ask permission to do something, you could go do it because like the protocol itself would or should throw out things that would cause harm to the network. That's the whole idea. Like you can go try to broadcast a bad Bitcoin transaction, a transaction that doesn't actually comply with the protocol, and it throws it out. It's the most secure network in the world. And so I feel like we're moving to a world where we have some building blocks that we can begin to organize or help organize people in ways that do the job of governance. Like instead of government, like I'm more interested in this idea of governance. And so we can do the job of governance in an absolutely new way. And I think that like that's where the hope is. So it's not the centralized or the decentralized. It's that you have sort of this other model which allows you to encode, NBU, whatever you want to call this, rules in new systems at whatever size scale you want, really, and experiment with that. And it's the experimentation that I think will help us and lead us to some better form of governance. I think it's pretty obvious that like the big top down stuff is broken, but really, I mean, hey, let's have no government. That also kind of seems broken.
Yeah. In what ways do you feel the Taiwanese style of governance impacts people the most? The difference in it, and like. I'm curious if you see the implications of maybe the levels of representative government playing a role in either how slow or fast or something else, or like how would you compare and contrast the U.S. style versus the Taiwanese style?
Oh, that's a really great question. The U.S. style, I mean, I can just speak for a moment on the U.S. style. I think the U.S. style that is like, at the core of U.S. is this idea of states' rights within sort of a federated system. And not to sound nostalgic or anything, but I feel that the source of power in the U.S. was this ability for states to innovate and for the federal to pick just the best of the states in what they were doing, right? So you have this idea, you can amend the Constitution through a Bill of Rights. To get something on the Bill of Rights, you needed a certain threshold of states to do that. And so you have like radical experimentation at the state level, stability over time at the federal level. And I think that's just like a massive competitive advantage. There's no other place in the world that really has that right. Now in Taiwan, extremely centralized, top-down government, even though it's a democracy, extremely top-down, extremely centralized. And they had almost like a fiasco in 2012. There was this huge protest, And not to go into the protest too deeply, because it's a long story in and of itself. But out of that protest came a very, very grassroots, almost like an open source, like hacker culture of, hey, we need to develop tools that make this black box, which is what our democracy has become. We need to make that accessible for everyday people. So like housing prices were out of control in Taiwan. One of the highest in terms of the gap between rich and poor, like Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, these are up there with any country in the entire world. And so people were very, very frustrated that housing prices were non-transparent, kept going up, how politicians would vote on stuff. And so they began to take this idea of forking government. Like you can fork source codes. You can go to GitHub, you can fork the repository.
Cool.
They would take,
Sean, not to interrupt you, but take like 3 inches back from the mic. Sometimes it
sure
like pop. Yeah, not a big deal, but
sure.
keep going.
No, thanks, Willie. So they would take this approach of something that was a black box and use really roughly the equivalent of our Freedom of Information Act to get the information. And then they would structure it using APIs. So it could be accessible in applications and programs. And so kind of a very, very simple practical example, a lot of listeners might have heard this one. During the early days of the pandemic, there was huge shortages of everything from, food, toilet paper, masks, like all the kind of basic stuff. And so somebody using the API whipped up like a Google Maps where you could figure out where the resources were. And so these are things that you could say, well, a really good top-down government should do. They should provide their citizens with, hey, where are the resources? But I felt that like the more interesting model was, nope, why doesn't the government just say, hey, we're going to open up this data, and the citizens would then go develop the APIs so that the app developers and people that are hackers and having fun could go do that. And so I think Taiwan, what they really got right over the past, let's say 10 years, was this notion of, and it's not perfect. There's a lot of flaws in it, but the promise of this sort of top-down government that meets from the bottom up, and citizens somehow can work in the middle. I think that's absolutely unique, and sort of how the U.S. figured out this at the state and the federal level. There's a bunch of issues with it now. Taiwan figured out at this kind of open source, kind of really citizen grassroots level and the top-down level. And both systems are really busted, a ton of problems, but I find a lot of hope in both of these systems because they're able to kind of use the best of the decentralized, if you will, with the ability to organize at a larger scale.
Mm. Yeah, it almost seems like maybe a guiding philosophy that at least has been exhibited so far would be have one organization or country, we'll call it, with a shared identity, and have the ability to have chaos at one level. So the state level, there's a lot of competition for what laws should be enacted. People are moving between states to go to the areas where they prefer for various reasons. But then at the federal level, it's slow moving. Hopefully, I think it should be lightweight, where they're not like producing a ton of services for society. They're more determining, I think, high level ideas like what are the rules for who should be allowed to get in, get out, that kind of high level decision, but allow the day-to-day decisions to be debated on a state level. And through that mechanism, it seems like while you may move slower, you're more resilient in the long run.
I think that's right. I think it is the resilience, and it's the and just the innovation that can come out of that. If you have like a common people, like in the U.S., and they can organize in smaller subsystems and be like utterly autonomous. Well, I guess not utterly, but they're reasonably autonomous. And then there's some mechanism that allows for the best to bubble up. And I think when the federal government is at its best, it's curating the things that really work and trying to kind of pick best practices. It's like what we do as startups, right? Is you're talking with friends, you're looking, okay, that person's company failed because they did that. That person's company succeeded because they did that. Hey, maybe I should give that one a try too. And over time, as a collective, you get better. You get better together. But it's not like there's this really heavy-handed top-down force saying that before you can do anything, you have to ask permission. I think that's the ultimate killer of innovation is this requirement to ask permission before you can experiment. Because whenever that happens, you just the ability to tinker, the ability to fail goes away because you have to present yourself. I know you have a background in payments. If you want to do anything financial, you have to present yourself such that the financial system understands you. And that means it has to look like something they've done before, which by definition can't be an innovation. And so whenever you have this thing where you have to ask permission first before you can do something, I think it's extremely hard to advance as a civilization.
Yeah.
Extremely hard.
Yeah. And I think that evolves. The evolution of that process of having to ask has to be a systemic change to the way that in the case of payments, like money flows, because society's willingness to tolerate mistakes and iteration on people's money is very low. That has happened. We've developed the banking system. Banks have gotten robbed. People have lost money. There's been a lot of iteration over centuries. And we're kind of in this like stable state where it's functional enough. And it's also very difficult to see what's not being innovated on. Like you can't know how bad it is until you could see how good it could be in the future. But at least today, the banking system's not screaming bad in the US. Most people, when you tell them about crypto, you tell them about all the advantages, they say, well, where's the price going to go? Or, my bank's kind of slow. It's not open on the weekends, but it's not terrible. And people are slow. But when you go in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, where the banking system is not either credible or existent at all or accessible to people, the benefits of the technology scream louder. It's like that's what sort of catalyzes, in my view, this leapfrogging effect in different parts of the world, which is cool because that keeps the world moving in different places. How did you see the gateway into this world? I know that it had to do with your dad, the trust, understanding of how trusts work in from a legal perspective. But I love to hear that story on how you the light bulb went off. For sure.
There was two things that were going on in parallel. So first was I got married. I had a kid, I got married. My wife was getting ready to have a kid, I should say. I had nothing to do with that. My job ends pretty early. But really what I was thinking about was, oh man, now I'm going to be a dad. If something happened to me, because I was traveling a lot, I'd go between Asia and the US once a month. If something happened to me, what would be the things I would want to leave to him? And it hit me that all of the stuff that I really cared about, they were digital. So photos, ebooks, music. At the time, I was just as 2012, I was just getting into Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin was on my list of things that I wanted to put into my trust, into my will. And my dad makes trusts. He's an estate planner. And he said, okay, we have to make you a trust, Sean. And so let me know what you want to put in that trust. And then what are the rules? What happens if you die? Who should they go to? How do your assets get dispersed? All that kind of stuff. And so he had absolutely no clue what to do. He's a California lawyer. Absolutely no clue what to do about anything digital. And what he kept asking me was, well, is this your property? And to me, that was I had never really actually even thought about what is property. And I'm of course it's mine. I bought it. How could it not be mine? And that led to a whole bunch of book reading, a whole bunch of talking with different lawyers, and kind of piecing together the history of property. And so property rights, they were created for land. This was in the 13th century. Mm-hmm. They were created for land. they were extended to knowledge like patents and trademarks and copyrights. And so back then, I mean, there was literally a time when only kings and queens and churches could own land, and patents were granted as monopolies for friends of the king and queen. Like you could get a patent for starch or tobacco, and that meant that only you could ship that or only you could transport that. And the democratization of that, so the ability for anyone to own land, the ability for anyone to develop an idea, unlocked massive amounts of wealth in the world. Like real estate's $200 plus trillion asset class. It's very, very hard to know how big intellectual property is, but like a software company like Microsoft or Google is really just an intellectual property. I mean, a company is just a collection of contracts that accrue value. I mean, it's like at the end of the day, these systems, this is where our value is stored. And then you fast forward to the internet, and if you buy something, like you buy an ebook or you enter into a streaming service or anything like this, it's not about ownership. It's about licensing. And so, of course, all of the Web3 stuff, the excitement in there around actually owning something, this is obvious now. In hindsight, back in 2012, 13, I was just absolutely convinced that the digital economy could be much bigger, would be much bigger than the current sort of nation state based economies that we have. And to get there, you would need to have digital property rights. All markets depend on property rights. You take away property rights, you don't have markets anymore.
And when you say the word property, how do you define it today?
So property is just, property is kind of this interesting thing. So it's completely like an intellectual construct. It doesn't exist in nature. Property is a thing that belongs to someone. So it's a relationship between things and people. That's how you think of property. It's this abstract concept of things and people. And the way that it gets organized is known as property rights. And the way I think about property rights from an economic perspective is it's a bundle. So it's the right to use the asset, the thing. It's the right to earn income from the thing. It's the right to transfer that thing. And then in kind of a really neat, like reflexive way, it's the right to defend your rights to that thing. And so these four, using it, earning income from it, transferring it, and then defending it, these are what society has kind of empirically agreed upon as the best way to decide, hey, how should you use things? Like who should own what? You have a home, you have an idea. What should you do with this? Who gets credit for it? Who gets money when something good happens? Who gets liability when something bad happens? And so these are all property rights. And it's almost like oxygen. We don't really think about it that much. Until it's gone.
Yeah. It seems like one of these things that feels intuitive when it's simple, like a cup or a house, because you can physically touch it and it stays exactly where it is. But when it moves into the realm of the abstract, when it's like the concept of a company or the concept of a digital piece of ownership, I mean, you can't literally bake down. I don't know, maybe you could, but when I think of a website, for instance, a website is, if you bake it all the way down, it's a pattern of switches on some motherboard, right? Like, so there's no thing that exists. It's just it's a pattern that's replicated in electrons on a screen. So do you feel like the definitions get vague when you move into the digital world? And is that a cause of some of the ambiguity on laws in the crypto world? And curious your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think it's really, so, I mean, you can go all the way back to when ideas could be ownable. So this is 14th century. Now we're talking 14th century, 15th century. So a long time people have been wrestling with this. How is it possible that I can own a thought? If I have that thought and you have that thought, well, how, like I say, I thought that first, like you're thinking that deprives me of my thought. It's like, no, like we can hold the same idea in our heads at the same time. Why do we need a property system for that? And so for hundreds and hundreds of years, we've worked through all of these things. Like the lawyers have figured out that when you have clear, stable property rights, you can invest in the future. You can build systems that unlock all kinds of new wealth. You get economic stewardship. So people begin to really care about, preserving wealth. People begin to really care about preserving the environment. When you own a home, I think nobody in the history of Earth has ever washed a rental car, right? So when you own something, you take care of it. So there's all of these really nice attributes that come about from a system of individual property ownership. And of course, there's also problems with that. As anybody that's done anything with software knows, software patents are a big issue. Now, so we figured it out for ideas. And then you could say, well, what's the difference between an idea and a piece of data or a file that, again, you could have on your computer, I could have on my computer. I'm not depriving you of anything. Doesn't seem like it, at least, having it on my computer. Why can't we both have it on our computer? And so the answer is really the same thing back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, is that you can just create a more inclusive, more innovative financial system if you assign property rights and you allow people to monetize that, to grow that, to invest in that, to decide how they would like to exercise those property rights. And when the internet came around, really the lawyers that were involved were IP lawyers. And I think this is, of course, my opinion here, but I think they looked at this whole thing and they said, this is awesome. We can make everything license agreements. You don't ever have to sell anything. We can absolutely have control over how anybody uses anything in perpetuity, right? And kind of the real problem with this is that this notion of private property, which is like real fundamental to the way the U.S. system works and the way a lot of the democracies in the world work. The idea that the individual can decide how to use something, and society at large will protect that. So I can decide how I want to use my car, use my home. If somebody comes in to take that from me, like, society will defend it, like the police will defend it. Right? And that's a really, really radical idea if you stop back and you think about it. Right? An individual makes a decision, and the full force of the government acts upon defending that decision. Right? So that's super, super radical. Now, this idea did not translate over to the digital environment. And I think for structural reasons, it was possible. Like, Apple could say, hey, anything that you make, we're going to get 30% of, or if not 30%, we're going to tell you what you can and cannot do. Because, I mean, typically private property outside of the time of war has never depended upon a third party to tell you what you can and cannot do with it. You can do whatever you want with your car, under limitations. If you drive into a crowd and kill people, you're responsible for it. But you can choose to, rent your car, crash it into a telephone pole. That's what you want to do. It's yours, right? And homes are the same thing. So Airbnb, Uber, all of these type of really transformative, like societal level transformations come about because of this idea of individual private property.
Do you feel like
what we're seeing in the Web3?
Can I ask you a quick question? Do you feel like the rub comes from the fact that digital property can be duplicated infinitely at no cost? I mean, is that when you say Apple takes 30%, they couldn't, if Apple to try to take 30% of the t-shirts I pay or the t-shirts I make as a t-shirt company, that seems much easier to understand the violation there. But if it's free to distribute, really the idea that the concept of the creation is what's valuable. The app, the patterns on the app, the gamification, all the things that are baked into it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real contradiction here. So if you look at, let's take Microsoft as an example. I shouldn't just keep beating up on Apple. I quite love Apple as a company. I love their products, but I think that their current business model is a huge problem. Let's go to Microsoft for a moment. And so the same argument could be made, hey, once Microsoft makes Windows or makes Office, to make an additional copy of that, well, why should that cost money? I mean, the marginal cost is zero, to use economics term, right? So why should they make money on that? They should make money if they put it on a CD and put it in Best Buy, but they shouldn't be able to make money if they put it on the internet. Or somebody else should just be able to tax the hell out of that or take a huge piece out of that because Apple or because Microsoft doesn't need to make any money on that. So I think the whole argument is quite peculiar if you step back and you say, well, Apple exists because they are able to have strong intellectual property rights on their phone, on their operating system, on everything they make. And the reason they're able to have that is because the U.S. government doesn't say, hey, every time you do anything, we're going to tax you, right, on your marginal costs, right? Extremely high on your marginal costs because your marginal costs are zero. So sorry, Apple, it doesn't cost you much to make this operating system. So instead of paying the typical corporate tax rate, you're going to have to pay instead of like the credit card processing rate of 3%, you're going to have to pay 30%. So Apple, instead of paying corporate tax rate, somebody that actually makes a physical thing that ships to people, or Amazon, same thing, right? Instead of AWS, we're going to tax you guys at 10 times what everybody else pays, right? So again, we've constructed societies around this idea that there are intangible goods that have property rights that people want to be able to use the way they want to use them. And in the digital environment, we have not, like outside of the Web3 environment, we have not been able to get an economy going that doesn't depend upon corporations, the permission of corporations to do something, the rules of corporations to do something. I think like the only rules that should determine what you can and cannot do, say if you're an app developer, should be the rules of the government. I mean, why does the corporation get to decide what is permissible? To me, that doesn't make any sense.
What about an example like this? Say I opened up a gaming store where people can come in, different games. We play tag over here. We play hide and go seek over here. Simple games, and we define the rules of engagement. Otherwise, you have to leave the store. And that feels pretty constitutionally aligned, right? I have the freedom to open up a business. I have the freedom to determine the rules while people are in there, and I can ask people to leave if for any reason.
Sure.
It kind of feels like, say, then I go in the tag game and I break all the rules. Like I'm it, but then I break every rule in there. To me, that feels analogous to like I violate a terms and conditions of a YouTube video, and YouTube removes my content. I go back and forth on this all day, but I do tend to land on the fact that I think it is within the constitutional right of the private company to remove people from their platforms, and it's up to the company to decide what kind of content and rules that they want.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you if you ignore scale. So if you think about it from like a first principles perspective, you have a small company, even a large company, they produce something, and they should have every right to say how that gets, like how somebody buys that, what they can do with it, what you can. So like if you come to my restaurant, I have the right to kick you out if I want to. I have the right to exclude you. I have the right to say you can't do this, you can't do that. Now, where I think things break down is when the restaurant is so big that it's, let's say, feeding a city or feeding a state or feeding a nation. Okay, so everybody needs to go to that restaurant, and so now, to a large degree, the way you make your money, the way you communicate with your family, the way that you organize socially, is governed by private companies. So it's no longer in this kind of Bill of Rights type direction. You don't have freedom of association. You don't have, I mean, the Fourth Amendment's not really the right to privacy, but it's sort of like that. It's like people can't, it's about warrants, and for the government or for authorities to know what you're doing, they need, to be able to go to a court to get permission to go look at your stuff, or First Amendment relates to what you can and cannot say, right? And so it's only when technology is so embedded in our everyday life that it begins to have an effect on how people can organize, how people can make money, how people can communicate. At that scale, when it intersects with the job of governance, the job of, for example, what this Bill of Rights was trying to do, when it hits at that level, then I think there's a societal, like a civilization issue that that cannot be ignored, right? So in a small world, when Apple is a 5% player in a market, when you have plenty of choice to go use a different phone, yeah, like Apple should be able to decide whatever the heck they want. But when the way that you run your business, the way that you participate in elections, the way that you communicate with your family is only through one of two like holes, that's the only way you get there. That I think those holes, they have to respect the laws that people have agreed with, right? So the Bill of Rights and the legal system that we have is what the people have decided we want to live under, right? And I think that's the problem. It's not a binary thing. It's not a black or white thing. To me, is as you scale this up, once you scale to the point where the whole country needs to use it, the whole planet needs to use it. Okay, now you're working on the governance issues, and it's not right for a private company to decide those things. People should fight back. People should demand that these type of decisions are being made under the rule of law, not under the rule of Apple or under the rule of Google.
Yeah. I've thought about this. Tell me what you think about this idea. So I take on the thought example of what if government took a very disciplined approach and said, we're not going to get involved in any private companies as long as the companies obey the law. And so we can like basically they don't go down the antitrust route. And I think about it taking the terms of like internet, which is a very important resource, and people debate whether it's a control, it should be influenced or controlled by the government as a utility. People use that word, or whether it should be private market. And I tend to think that in order to iterate on any system, in order for evolution to occur in any construct, there has to be a price. And I think of this could be viewed as like energy to use Bitcoin and keep Bitcoin's properties as we desire them to be safe, secure, fast, etc. It could be the evolution of a creature. Like in order for frogs to be fast jumpers and fast twitch, like some of the past frogs had to die. That's just the way that the nature's, it's like a pattern of nature. It feels deeply embedded. This idea of like a few you have to test, go beyond the realm of what we know to be true, and then some get bitten, and then that's how we learn. And so I think if that's true, then what would prevent the evolution from happening is if we limited the experimentation. So that would mean if the government controlled, say in the case of internet, it said this is the only internet that's allowed and it's going to be available for everyone. No, like you said earlier, you have to ask permission if you want to launch a new internet service. Things slow way down. And I think the other side, the contrary concept would be let it rip and see what happens. And I think in the case of internet, some people won't have internet, and some companies will exploit the S-curve, where like, say, Apple, in the case of their iPhones, they have a huge market share. They jack up prices. People feel exploited. Now there is a huge market opportunity. And say Apple is like kicking people off and they're like booting developers. Now there's like homeless people who can't get access to iPhones. Yeah. Uber and Lyft, this is a big part of the debate here, is like, if I'm kicked off of Uber and Lyft, I might have no option for travel. And that travel is a very important thing. So, but I think as that starts to happen, new opportunities open up. It's like, okay, now we got to solve the internet issue. Well, if I can't open up a local area, then, and all these people are without internet in slow areas, like Starlink happens. We're now using a whole new, like the eclipse of evolution happens. And that could be the case of, if I don't have access to the restaurant in my area, well, then like a new way of distributing food. Like people are so good at solving problems, and the solution to the problem becomes more in demand when the people are compressed by the existing options. Like as Apple exploits people or charges the highest amount they can, then new opportunities become more relevant. It's like, well, now our users willing to pay a lot. All you got to do is beat the competitors. So as the competitors become worse, more expensive, harder to access, they take advantage of their monopoly. I think of it as creating market opportunity for the wave of evolution beyond them. I don't know if any of that made sense.
It does, and I would really agree with you. I feel that. So markets aren't perfect, and I think like the pure sort of like laissez-faire, hands off, let everything rip type approach. Markets have their own externalities. So markets, you need to be able to have information to price something. That's what a market does amazing. There's a lot of things. My wife does an amazing job raising our two kids, and there's no price for that. There's no ability to price that, right? And so, like as a civilization, we have to struggle with economic goods and social goods. Okay, and where you see again and again these failures are in the social goods. We just don't have good tools to price social goods, to let markets work on social goods, to allow competition on social goods, to acknowledge the value of social goods. By social, I don't mean socialism. I mean sort of like the lighthouse stuff, right? You have these public goods that everybody uses, everybody benefits from, everybody needs, but capitalism as a system of allocating resources just doesn't allocate things to social goods. It just doesn't work, right? There isn't enough money for me to pay somebody to take care of my kids the way that my wife takes care of our kids. I mean, it's just incredible, right? And these happen again and again. So I'm a surfer. You say, what is the value of the oceans? Okay, to be able to go surf clean water, and it's, I mean, again, these are goods that are utterly important to a functioning human, like to a life, right? To have a good life, you need these things. And markets are incredibly good at anything economic, and they really have their issues with things that are social. And so when it comes to organizing people, when it comes to governance, when it comes to all of these political things that you're kind of hinting on, we don't have good tools. Capitalism doesn't really know how to do this well. And we have been innovating on this. People have been innovating on this. I mean, startups can make money, can have high valuations without transactions. They can have attention. How much attention do you have? How long does somebody use your product, right? So time can be money, right? And now capitalism can work on time, right? But there's a whole category of social goods, public goods, whatever you call these things, that are incredibly important for society. And I think this is like, if I had to put my finger on where does what's the real issue, and why am I so excited about Web3 crypto, is that I think it's a capitalistic system that can allow for social goods, public goods, to get funded, to be able to participate in society at scale, to be able to experiment. Because I mean, like the whole purpose of governance is we want to make civilization better. Like that's why we would do this. Like as opposed to just like having your home in a bunker.
Yeah.
And you have your water, you have your food, you have your guns, and you don't care about the world, right? Like you want to live with people, you want to experience life, you want to travel, you want to love. And how do you do that in an amazing way? And I think it's a combination of the economic goods and the social goods. And it's really the social goods that the current system is failing the most on. So like you said, kicking somebody off a platform, you could say, well, they weren't making any money anyways, right? Just get them out of here, right? But now you've robbed them of this social good that this platform provided for them. And the government can only do so much there. It's too expensive. It's like onboarding a customer for a bank, $600 or whatever it is these days, versus onboarding a customer to Bitcoin. It's free. You just download a wallet, right? And so I think we need to be able to experiment at this social good level, and that's where the tech companies like Google, like Apple, are really holding back, because the only lens they have is the economic lens. They're a business. That's what they have to have. Yeah.
And I imagine that can't change. I mean, Google realistically can't change their business model.
It can't change. No.
Right. They're just entrapped in.
I mean, they can't change the way that they value things. I mean, it's a corporation. The purpose of a corporation is to accrue value to shareholders. Right. Now, you can say that they have a mission, that they want to do stuff. And I think Apple probably really does want to improve privacy. And so insofar as privacy is aligned with the business model of selling hardware, you bet they're going to improve privacy. Right. But the mission of the company and the economic incentives of the company have to be utterly aligned. The bigger the company gets, the more the pressure is on the business model side. When you take a company public, you are literally owned by the shareholders, and the shareholders are protecting their property, which is the company that you run, right? And so we just don't have good systems to organize people that want to achieve a mission that perhaps is a blend of social and economic goods.
That's fascinating.
I think that's the.
Do you have a few minutes to go over? Or are you dead?
I do. We can go along as long as you want. Yeah.
This is super interesting. So I think of, I like drawing parallels between naturally occurring ecosystems that are very complex and difficult to distill. Okay. So take the case of the body with all the different, we have, I think, thousands, tens of thousands, probably more different types of viruses in our body, bacteria in our body. And it's the ecosystem itself that provides the chaos at the ecosystem lower level is what provides the stability at our level. Like I can eat a veggie burger and be fine because all that is happening. And I think of this as like, it's almost like, how does that draw the parallel here? And what is I view a tumor is when there's a pattern of repeating self-beneficial. It's like a superior system, a superior process of benefiting, like the tumor benefits itself by growing. Like it's, and I view this not to compare Apple and say they're a tumor in any way, but the growth of a very, very large company, if you take a benevolent perspective, they are only as valuable as people are willing to pay them. So they're only as valuable to society as the value creation that they're offering. But at a certain point, it's like a tragedy of the commons. It's like when, all the farmers get together and they each individually want to harvest the most food, but collectively, if there's no organization at the town level, then they might deplete all the water in the soil and then everyone dies. And so it's part of this like game mechanic where maybe, I don't know how the founding fathers or the people at that time when they created the Constitution viewed the world, but it seems like they were strongly influence to move away from the centralized, king and queen, mono governance structure. And we have a heavy value system of the individual. And I think that we tend to look through the individual rights perspectives much more than like the social. And I view that tension as like, what do we have a right to as a group versus individual? It's easier, maybe that's just through our culture, to see the individual rights of ownership and protection and everything. But then, like to your example with the surfing, I think of that is also individually, and it's also valuable socially. Like we need this rock to sustain us, otherwise it's game over. And I tend to think that if people have access to information and they're allowed to vote, and that could be voting for your representative or it could be buying shares in a company, then as long as the information is transparent, then the more transparent it is, in theory, the better the decisions are, the better I'm able to buy the companies. But those companies, if their value is not directly aligned with what's good for me as a group, then I'll stop investing with them and they'll die. And it seems to me like we have this, I don't like the word capitalism because it has a lot of association, but really it's the free flow of ideas and services, products and services. And it would seem to me that a company, say for instance, who values cleaning up the ocean, or Apple, a huge part of their site and their company is dedicated to like sustainability. And they do that because it benefits them financially, I believe. I mean, I think the people are individually motivated at the company, sure, but like the company is its own incentives, and the company wants to be at least attractive to shareholders. And so as long as they're actually doing what they say they're doing, they're not lying on the site, and they're actually preserving the forest, that they're getting they're doing all the things that they say they're doing, it seems like it can also be the solution. As long as there's pressure from shareholders on the companies to do the things that benefit us collectively and socially. I don't know do you see that mechanism through where there is kind of naturally arising pressure on companies to do what's best for everyone collectively?
Yes, but it's warped, and it's warped in a way that I feel is unhealthy. And so, okay, so again, you go back to the corporation, and the purpose of a corporation, and not really just the purpose of a corporation, but the way that a corporation is structured and who has the rights. And it's all around this nexus of contracts that capture value and its economic value. And there's not that balance there. So as you scale the corporation up, higher than the nation state. So if you scale that corporation, the reach of the corporation, the power of the corporation, if you scale that up above the nation state, which is how we people are governed right now, right? So once you scale it up above that, I think you get really peculiar failure modes, and that's what we're hitting now.
That's interesting.
Right? It's once you scale the governance structure. Sorry, once you scale the corporation, which has a very, very pure incentive structure, but it's economic, right? The corporation can only react to economic incentives. You stop buying somebody's product, they die, right? It's only reacting to that, right? I mean, at least a good company would be, right? And once you scale that up above kind of the societal level, it has really, really peculiar failure modes that I think we're hitting up against now.
Yeah.
It would almost be like you have an island like Galapagos, and you've evolved some species on this island, and then you bring in some other species, or you take the species to a different island, and then it just like wreaks havoc, and you're like, well, why, like, how could there be havoc? Shouldn't this thing like evolve through natural selection to the point where it has kind of like a symbiotic thing going on here? It's not going to kill everybody, right? And I think the answer is that corporations have reached a scale that they are transnational, and governance is not transnational. And so the real difficult problems that you would hope to be able to solve at a societal level are increasingly difficult to solve because of this region, like because of sort of only being able to deal with economic things, not being able to deal with the combination of economic and societal. And it has to do with incentives. And not that, not that crypto or Web3 has these solutions. The only difference between crypto and Web3 is just that you can experiment without permission. So like if Apple and Google went back to the idea that a computer is a general purpose device that you can put what you want on it because you own it, I would be like, okay, all right. We're going to get all kinds of new companies that are going to be built. There's going to be all kinds of chaos, all kinds of neat things going on. What you can and cannot do will be governed by the rules of society in the different places they want to do it. And we'll be fine, right? And so like you could say, well, just go make a competitor to Apple, or just go make a competitor to Google, right? And the argument to that is that these corporations have gotten so big that other than the US government and China, who can actually hold them accountable? Who can actually just who can hold them accountable? And I think there's no one, right? No individual person can do that, right? And so it's in this like cancer type loop. Like I'm utterly convinced Apple would be a better company, a more profitable company if they opened up their app store. if they let anybody install anything they want to on that phone. We're past the period of having the closed ecosystem being conducive to innovation, and we're at the stage now where I really feel that it's a scale thing. When you have billions of people using something, it's a different scale. The federal government has rules that the state government doesn't have, and then vice versa, and it has to do with scale. And so we're just at this stage right now in many places across tech where the scale has gotten so big, and the centralizations of the power have gotten so strong that it's
yeah. I love that. Man, you sparked so many ideas. I want to bounce some things back. So I think of, I get to tell you this story. So I used to live in Boston, and I was on a walk one day in Boston in wintertime, and I'm coming down this hill and I see a church. Behind that is a state building, and behind that is a skyscraper. But what was interesting is that they were each at their time when they were built, the tallest buildings in town. So if you think about it, like the church is kind of trying to reach up and establish its precedence, its superiority over the townspeople. When the church was built, it was the most important thing in town. It was the thing that people came, they worshiped literally. And then the next thing that happened was the state. So the separation of church and state. Boston's a really old town. People, then the Puritans came, they more closely identified themselves with their religion than they did the country, or the identity of a country. And we take that for granted because we grew up in the time when people most closely identified with your country. Like you think of yourself as more, generally speaking, an American more than like a Christian. And especially that pattern continues today. Whereas today, you look at the large skyscrapers, the biggest buildings in town today are owned by Salesforce, Apple, etc. And I think that is so interesting because it represents not only just the physical and economic influence that the organizations at each different level hold, but the identification that each one of us individually tends to have. Like people might today, it wouldn't surprise me today if I met an Apple employee and they're like, yeah, I'm more proud to be an Apple employee than I am to be a member of the American party, right? Like a member of our country. And I find that mind blowing to parse out, because this concept of a country is not linear throughout history, right? It was once, sort of you're under this rule of a king and you don't identify with this per se. And then I think about your methods of failure modes. And I view one of the methods of failure modes that tangibly comes to mind is the influence that private companies have on the legislative branch of government. Specifically the rules, like I think of big tech or big pharmaceutical companies and healthcare certainly playing this game of like influencing the politicians to either push a narrative and try to lead people in a certain direction, or just literally change rules. And it's almost through a growth of an evolution of competition in the early stages of companies to where they really are aligned with providing the most value they possibly can. Like as a startup, this is the most pure sense. Like you survive to live another day if you get customers who pay you. You're not thinking about politicians at all. But as you get super, super large, your primary concern is staying large. Like you just want preservation becomes the dominant board discussion. And so it's like, how many billions are we spending on lobbying? And that becomes, I think, I'm not in the boardroom at large pharmaceutical companies, but they seem to be incentivized to stay where they are and, make it look like they're doing all the good in the world. And it's hard to parse out. Like it's hard. There's a lot of debate on this. Like to what level are they influencing politicians and what level are they providing real good in the world? And I think the rubber meets the road on the trust that you place in the institutions to bring forth the truth. And the truth in the scientific sense is the measurement of data. It's like, okay, well, how useful are, in the case of like pharmaceutical companies, the products that they're making? I only bring that up because it's been so top of mind, although it has decreased recently through COVID. And I think that if you distill what's actually happening down, it's this. It's like we're now at this point where large corporations have a serious influence over the political narrative, and what to do about it, frankly, is like the next question you'd ask, because it's quite clear that it's happening. It's unclear as to the level that it's happening, but the trend seems clear. So even if you agree on the trend, you're concerned. You might think CDC is the most transparent, wholehearted organization in the world and only wants to serve people. It's a valid perspective, but then you say, well, where's the trend going? And you could debate about where we are exactly in that cycle, but I don't know. I mean, how do you continue this thought process? Do you see decentralization, technology, crypto, or associated types of property and contract management systems as somehow eclipsing and being the next skyscraper? Or do you think is it like a bigger evolution where that whole game is now spread across society? Like, does that make sense?
It does, totally. And I think there's like this. So there's this decentralization, centralization discussion, and then there's like a second order effect out of that, and it is how can we organize people to achieve outcomes in ways that we think are more beneficial to society at large. So this could be making people more happy, making people more wealthy. How do we do that? And so for me, the discussion, it can get stuck in the centralized versus decentralized. And I agree with you that it's actually, it goes back and forth, over time, right? Things get too centralized, they get decentralized. But we've always operated under these modes of, like either you have centralized control or you have the decentralized control. And the centralized control, it sort of caps out at the limit previously at the nation state level. Now it's capping out at the limit of the corporation level. The corporation can basically go across the whole globe. The corporation is just, it has its own set of incentives, right? And the next evolution, if I could sort of speak to that and say it that way, that I hope happens, is that we come up with alternative structures to corporations, alternative structures to nation state governments, right? And we learn how to scale these up, right? And so like the corporation is amazing at producing a good or service that society wants. Like it just has the most like amazing signal. If you wanted to make a machine that could produce a good or service that society wants, a corporation is a awesome solution.
You could almost like, can I interject briefly and say, I almost think corporations are optimized to win on the game of money, where politicians are, the government is optimized to win on the game of physical power, right? They're a monopoly on physical power.
Yeah, physical power.
And I almost think like churches and religions are optimized to win on the game of spiritual worship. Like, what do I really value? Oh, the church is the answer. Yeah. The government's the answer. Yeah. The corporation's the answer.
Okay. If you say it that way, now it's like super clear what I want to say here. So I want to win on the social and economic together at the same time. Like, I think we just no longer can exist. Like, we no longer can ignore money as being important, nor can we ignore how do you organize society as being important. You have to operate on both at the same time. And these corporations, they're able to capture our government so easily because they have all the money, right? And the government, they just want the power, right? Like most people in there, they don't care about the money, they care about the power. And well, what about civilization? Like, what are the experiments we're going to run that are going to find us the next path of evolving, of uplifting civilization? How do you run those experiments? And I have to imagine that those experiments are, how do you optimize on this social and economic good at the same time? Right? Like, how do you do that? If I have all the money in the world and I have terrible health, I can't go surfing. no good, right? If I can go surfing every day, but I have no money, I can't feed my family, no good, right? So how do you operate on both of those at the same time is something that I feel is incredibly lacking from both our corporations and from our government. Yeah. The government solution to money is just here, take some.
Yeah. That doesn't work.
The corporation, their solution to sustainable society is to, I don't know, some carbon subsidies, right?
ESG.
Or we'll go buy shoes for somebody in Africa. It's like, come on.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, not to sound like a hater, but it's like, come on, let's really solve the problem.
Yeah, it's really they're directly aligned. They're directly incentivized to make people believe that they're doing something. They're not. The corporation doesn't really win if they go out of their way to preserve the ocean. Like, if you're,
there's no structure that I know of, at least, of a corporation that ensures that the alignment is there for it to, let's say, clean the ocean, right? Like, at some point, it will scale to the point where the economic alignment forces decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I get, yeah.
And the government feels like, you mentioned kind of the founding fathers, but if you look at like the reason they had these three different branches of government is that they knew it would all be about the power. And so let's put three up there, and they're always fighting each other, and nobody really has all the power. And that's a pretty cool system if you think about it. It reaches this stable equilibrium because everybody's fighting for the power. Nobody really gets all the power. I think that's pretty neat. Yeah. But then when the scale, like, technology is a lever, right? It's like an Archimedes lever. And once the technology can be applied to people outside of just one jurisdiction, whatever that jurisdiction is, once you can apply it outside of that, you just have these failure modes. And the failure modes actually have to do with capitalism and capitalism not being able to allocate to social goods, right? So these are all interrelated, and my hope is just that there'll be enough experimentation in crypto, in Web3, that, I love DAOs and I hate DAOs. Like, I fucking hate how people are doing DAOs. Like, there was this DeFi project, let me just not name names, but the DeFi project had a CFO. And I'm like, what? Like, yeah. Are you DeFi? Like, how do you have a CFO if you're DeFi?
Yeah.
Right. And that particular DeFi project caused a lot of carnage to a lot of people. Right. And it's like, come on, guys, like we're trying to organize at a different level here. Right? I'm optimistic that this new way of having rules without rulers, cryptography, this new technology will allow us to construct systems that can do the economic and the social. And I don't know what that looks like. It doesn't look like a DAO. The DAO is like the extreme case right now, and it doesn't look like Coinbase either.
Yeah.
So, let me ask you a question. What do you find in that whole space the most inspiring right now?
I find what's most inspiring is the ability to. I find the projects that integrate into the existing incentive system. So let's take like money, for instance. They create a better good for everyone individually and socially through a more effective and efficient monetary collective and distribution system. So examples of that would be like, I think if you look at the most obvious existential risks we face as a society, the things that come to mind would be the destruction of our forests and thus our strong decline of biodiversity on the planet. And I think that's the leading root cause of climate change. In conjunction, that's the root cause that we haven't been able to come up with a practical solution for. I think the other being the energy production through fossil fuels, and we seem to be on the right trajectory there. And now I think it's like, how do you change the incentive structure of of effectively food production, because food production is what is destroying and causing the incentive system for the destruction of the biodiversity. We're cutting down rainforests to plant palm trees, like rows and rows and rows of palm trees. Farms are becoming monocrop farms with massive farm tools that are highly efficient. They're like on the peak of the S curve for efficiency, but they're causing the negative externality to everyone, and even themselves, on the depletion of biodiversity in the soil and in the forest. So I think one of the potential solutions can be a decentralized or distributed mechanism for food production. So you can have like people, we have millions of people who are in trucking and they want new jobs, presumably. Like, it's a big point that people talk about. I think that it'll become, my hope is that we move to a more locally produced, decentralized ownership of food production. So instead of like Monsanto being like the aggregation of all these other food companies and farms, you say, okay, here's the playbook, like go and you can optimize this using software. You just give us your address and we show you the like exact, you give us the layout of your property and we say, here's exactly what you should plant. Here's a button to buy it. Like, these seeds are going to grow strawberries and this and that. And it comes with like an instruction manual as to how to harvest them. So people can re-identify with the mechanism of food production, and in itself, it's like the problem is the solution. So I think about this one because it's such a big problem, but you could do things like, okay, people are interested in this. They want to make more money. They want a better job opportunity. And by the way, it also helps save the world. You start this concept. You have you can use a DAO for the purpose of having a community own the benefits, the proceeds from like this kind of mechanism of food production. And that could be scaled across the world. So it's almost like you're scaling little food production plants. Like, food is the most important thing in the world. Food, you can live without a home for a while, but you can't live without food for very long. So I just think it's so important. And then you could also say, okay, well, we're going to, centralize the distribution, or you're going to centralize the ownership, decentralize the ownership of the distribution. So you could say, well, there's a bunch of trucks that are intelligently routed to the different farms. Like, once you have all the information on food production on chain, it's like the whole thing can just efficiently route itself and everyone can be financially incentivized to make the whole thing work.
Yes.
So that's what,
one
thing that comes to mind as an example.
Yeah, I love the idea. Yeah, I love the idea because it's about like, how can you help people organize in smaller communities, but then that technology that you're using to organize them, it actually scales globally. Like, it's the same anywhere you are. You can just you can just fire up your own. Like, I could have a San Diego DAO. I don't know where you are. You're
Portland,
Boston?
Oregon.
Where are you
in Oregon? Yeah,
Portland. Okay, you could have the Portland, Oregon DAO, and then the DAOs could share resources together. It's like, it's just that level of, and to me, that's really governance, right? It's, you have people that are getting together to produce a good or a service, to live a lifestyle that wants to have something social, something economic in there. And how do you kind of uplift both of those variables at the same time? Mm-hmm. I think that's awesome. Yeah. And I think that would just have fewer externalities because you could feel it directly at your local level.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like I find that DAOs in particular are most effective when they are the most, when the thing you're talking about, whether it's food production or, I don't know, education, when it's the most effective at a local level. So there can be a lot. Like DAOs. There's never going to be one DAO that just owns all the DAOs. It's like kind of a self-eating prophecy. So the whole concept is like a lot of individual communities, and I could be a member of many different ones at once and benefit from them. And it's almost like it's like states, right? It's what we started off the conversation with, but states almost more granular or more specialized, let's just say, to the thing that you're doing. Like, a state oversees abortion, it oversees taxation, it oversees guns, it oversees monetary trade, it oversees transportation. Like the burden on one organization. So if you're a governor or you're a representative in that state, you might have a small team of people, but effectively you can only handle one thing at a time. There's no mechanism for voting on multiple things at a time. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like you would want a mechanism that would push as much governance as possible that could be done at the community level down to the community level. And then when communities wanted to work with each other, there would be some things that needed to be kind of cross communicating. And you'd want to have something a little bit bigger than that, a little bit bigger. But like at each stage, you have just as little as possible in that rules and governance and what's going on there.
Yeah. So well, I just throw out like a long-term thing. A long-term prediction is how that gets displaced is when, and I almost view that as this is where it gets kind of trippy and circular, is the relinquishing of responsibility. So whenever you have a completely decentralized system, there's a lot of power in the individuals, but there's also a lot of responsibility. Like if I'm voting for something in a direct democracy, for instance, I have to put in the work to come up with a sophisticated and correct answer. You know, I can't just give it to a representative. So I think that's where, you know, if you have a blockchain or DAO, for instance, that has all the right incentives, but people kind of fall asleep at the wheel, they don't do their homework, they become comfortable in the fruits of the previous orchestration, then they're like, you know, food just flows to me and everything just flows to me and I kick back. It's like, that's the deeper cycle, but.
Yeah, you need innovation. And I think that's what you're saying is like, if you can do it more at the city level or that smaller level, you have a better chance of keeping people engaged, keeping them interested.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's like
at the moment it gets super big, the moment it gets like at the state level is the moment you just check out because you're like, okay, there's too many people. It's not going to impact me.
Oh, no.
I'm just
I mean it more like, think about it this way. What would human beings do if we solved all the problems? Like we're just, you know, the first thing we're going to do is like, we'll probably eat all the food, have all the sex, and then we're going to just destroy something just to have more problems as well.
Yeah. No, I'm not worried about that. I mean, I think there's like an infinite number of problems, and I think people like to solve problems, or at least there's always a class of people that enjoy solving problems. So yeah, we'll be okay.
Tell me more what we're so deep in the show and I'm just now asking, so I feel embarrassed almost, but tell me more about where you guys are on this project and what's motivating you.
And Mike, like, feel free to cut.
No way, dude. That was
chunks.
No, we're not
right?
cutting anything.
Okay, cool. All right. So, and I guess in many ways, like, we needed to go through that before what we're doing even makes any sense whatsoever. So right now, so Bitmark, this company that I co-founded back in 2014, we're working on 3 things in parallel. I mean, a startup really should probably do one thing. We're doing 3 things. So the first thing that we did was to work on digital property rights. So what would be the mechanism that you would need to be able to define like a new bundle of rights? Because if you think about it, like copyright and things like this, like copyright was created in the US, at least in the 17th century. And they were really concerned about printing presses. Okay. So like created in 17th century, extended in 19th century, all trying to solve a really like a 16th century problem. And what we do at Bitmark is we deal primarily now, 99% of our time is in digital art. And specifically, how do you make a better ecosystem for artists that work in the digital format? And so historically, artists as a group of people have been sort of kept out of the upside of their work. When an artist produces work, they don't have any resale rights. When that artwork transfers hands, let's say that you paint 10 paintings, your 10th painting is a masterpiece. You sell it for, let's say, $1 million. Somebody sells it for $100 million later on. You get nothing from that. The 9 other artworks that you've sold before that, you get nothing from those. Any other creative field, whether it's writing a song or starting a company, you have this idea of equity. And so what we were working on was, how do you have a better set of rights for artists and a better set of rights for collectors? And what Feral File does is to organize artists into small groups. And so we run about 2 exhibitions per month Our bread and butter is this idea of a group show where we have a curator. The curator picks 5 to 10 artists. Each of those artists produce a new work. And again, it's all digital. Okay. And we did something that I'm especially proud of at the group level. So the artists, before they sell their artworks, I should say each artwork gets editioned. The editions can be unique. They can be the same. It's up to the artists and the curators. But let's say that there's 50 editions and there's 5 artists, 1 curator. So those first 6, they would get swapped with each other. So each artist gets every other artist's work. And then the remaining go up for sale. Okay. And so what this does is it uses kind of the best of collectivism and capitalism. If any one of those, say 5 artists has a breakout hit, their work goes for a lot of money. Every other artist in that show also owns one of their artworks. So you can kind of use collectivism to organize people. You can use capitalism to allocate value. And you can give, so not just the typical thing where when you resell an NFT, there's a royalty that goes to the artist. Of course, we also have that. But how do you operate at the community level so that artists can help other artists? Like, there's a lot of artists that are incredibly good. They just haven't had the chance of showing their work. They haven't had the audience that can recognize them. And so you can get a really good artist with a really good curator, and they'll pick 3 or 4 other artists that you maybe have never heard of. And together as a group, you're like, damn, that's good work. And then they go sell it, and everyone benefits financially. So Ferrophile, that's the name of that experiment. It's a new type of gallery. It's an online-only gallery. And it's we view ourselves as sort of like a new institution, if I can use that word, in the art ecosystem. And we're trying to operate under a much better bundle of rights. So the artist gets equity. And then on the collector side, the collectors also have some new rights that they previously didn't have. So typically, if you buy a painting or you buy a sculpture, if you wanted to show that off to people publicly, you would need permission. Okay. And of course, in the internet and the Web3 environment, that's sort of impractical. If you logged into OpenSea, or if you wanted to show your work in OnCyber, and every time you did that, you had to ask the artist, hey, could I do this? It would just make a mess of the whole system. And so we also gave collectors some really neat rights where they can, for example, download their artwork. They can show their artwork on their website, so it can be public or private. They can display it publicly, display it privately. So that bundle of rights, we have some that can be executed in smart contract, and then of course some that cannot. Right? I think for quite some time there'll be this sort of hybrid of wet code, if you will, and then source code, and you kind of have to use the best of both. Like lawyers actually write code. It's been debugged for 5,000 years. Engineers write code. Like, how do you bring the lawyers and the engineers together to be able to engineer better rights? That's sort of the heart of what we're doing. And then when we got Ferrophile going, it's been going now for about a year. A couple of months into that, we started collecting across a number of different marketplaces, and quickly realized that all of the crypto wallets that exist, MetaMask, all these kind of wallets, they were developed for coins and DeFi and trading, and not for digital art. So if you have an artwork that you have purchased, say from OpenSea, maybe the artwork was minted on art blocks, and you want to view this artwork on your phone, forget about it. Like, it can't play the software artwork. And so we started recently building a digital art wallet. So it's a crypto wallet that's specifically, it's for purpose. How can I bring this digital art into my everyday life so I can experience it on my phone? I can cast it up to TVs. Like, it can have an impact on my daily life. I think that's a huge missing piece of the whole NFT ecosystem, is because these NFTs, I mean, yes, they are tokens, but the point of the NFT really is to enjoy some type of content. Maybe you want to show it off. Maybe you want it's just for yourself. but it is about the content. It's about the artwork. It's not about the token, right? And wallets have not been engineered for that. So Bitmark at the secure property rights level, Feral File at the, hey, let's organize a community around a new set of rights, and then autonomy for how does the individual get to exercise their rights. That's the kind of the three legs of the stool.
And the projects are, so Bitmark Inc., and then you have Bitmark Autonomy and Feral File as the three projects underneath that.
Yes.
That's super interesting. I almost feel, in some way, I feel the recent run up in NFT prices and excitement seems to be a lack of proper tooling for the functionality of actually viewing and consuming the art. Like it seems like when anyone can post any picture of any piece of digital art as like their Twitter profile, although Twitter is doing something here, but you're right. Like the wallets have been effectively retrofitted to handle NFTs. Yeah. They're not specifically catered for art, which
yes. And I mean, what the NFT did for art was this. I mean, I can explain it this way: is that actually digital art has existed since the 60s. A lot of the artists that are now considered popular digital artists, crypto artists, they've been doing work for 10 years, 20 years, and they just never had an audience. And one of the main reasons they never had the audience was because the existing ecosystem, so the existing institutions, the museums, the galleries, the auction houses, well, they just thought that digital stuff is like for screensavers. Like that's not art. And there was no way for them to develop a collector base to make a living. And so they were really scrapping by. Now, what the NFT did was it connected together people with a digital money that luckily at the time had been appreciating rapidly. So this was like, I want to say it's like August of 2020. You had a lot of people that had their crypto wealth go up 5x. And then you had a lot of artists that, because of the pandemic, have like zero ability to make money. I mean, they were waiting tables, parking cars, doing this kind of stuff just to be able to survive, like as a starving artist. And well, all of a sudden you have an audience that could pay them directly, and they understood, hey, I'm going to get a token back that says I'm going to own this thing. And it's like, well, why shouldn't art be digital? I mean, music is digital, movies are digital. Like, doesn't it make sense that the art should be digital too? And so the crypto people needed zero convincing, and the artists needed money. And so you had this, like, I don't know, like you have peanut butter, I have jelly. Life is better, right? We get together, we make a sandwich. And I think that was, like, to me at least, the most unexpected, most like amazing love thing of 2020 was digital art and NFTs.
I think a lot of people who never thought of themselves as having a pathway to professional artistry now do. And it seems like we're in a space where the tooling out there, is amazing for allowing people who create content, any kind of content. I mean, artists, I think we generally associate with like visual, but any content can monetize better than ever before. My brother started a company called Cameo, and they do exactly this, where they allow people to monetize their attention that they've created. And I almost view artistry can be, in the broadest sense of the word, anything that people want to consume for the purposes of consuming itself, not necessarily for some other purpose.
Like, I mean, to date, NFTs, there's this fixation with scarcity, right? That like you need the scarcity, but actually if you take a kind of a step back and you look at, well, what is an NFT? It's just a really amazing kind of two-way link with a payment channel that connects two people, right? So it connects the person that made it with the person that wants to own it. And it's a communication channel and it's a payment channel. And you can decide, hey, what are the rights on both parties? And why does it have to be scarce? Why can't the whole world own something? right? And you could never do that before. It's just impossible. And so I think like there's going to be a massive wave of innovation when people begin to, like, some things people will want to be scarce for sure. But I think what the NFT actually does is it provides a business model for things to be abundant, but not free, right? So like this can be abundant. Everybody can own it, and you pay a little bit of money to own it, and you can support a massive creator base because you're going to pay a little bit of money for it. And maybe the other extreme is there's 5 of these or there's 1 of these in the world. But why can't there be millions of these in the world? Like it's this ability of the NFT to connect 2 people with a payment channel. It's going to reshape all distribution of any kind of content.
Yeah.
The better system.
It seems I can almost start to see how there's a sort of like positive and negative aspect to this, where you correctly, and I agree with you, framed out the positive, which is that there's now a network of tooling for payments to people who create content. I see, if there's a shadow side to this, I start to see it as like when anything becomes recognized by a lot of people, it has inherent value to it. You know, Jack Dorsey's first tweet, and that becomes something that if everyone could identify with it, then the ownership of that thing becomes a relevant topic. You know, because it has really social credit. I own Jack Dorsey's first tweet. Oh, that's cool. I mean, this is the whole world of like collector's items, like shoes and pogs and everything else. It's like there's not inherent value in and of itself, the distinguishing of like Jordan 6 shoes, but it doesn't mean that there's no value there. It just means that the value is stored in the social hierarchy. And I almost view it as the trap, the shadow side is we get so immersed, and I tend to think we already experienced this, is we get so immersed in the accumulation of value that we think there's real value there. Like I'm buying Jack Dorsey's tweet to make money. Well, you're kind of missing the point. Like the value in owning the shoe or whatever it is relative to what other people say it is. So there's there's a mechanism of positive feedback that I feel could like you said, the failure mode is interesting, because it's like, oh, all of a sudden we don't care anymore. Like I don't care about Jack Dorsey's first tweet. I don't care about Bored Apes. They're worth nothing anymore. And
which pretty much happened, right? I mean, it's like that's kind of where we're at right now. So you have, if I may, we'll just call those status goods.
That's a good phrase.
Okay? So things that people buy for status. Okay, and so if we fast forward 5 years, like, will status good exist?
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Will it be the only thing that people buy that looks like an NFT? I mean, come on, like,
no way.
Of all goods produced, status goods are a niche. Okay, now, the onus is on us working in the NFT space, whether this is art or music or any kind of digital item, digital thing that gets distributed. In a typical economy, a company wants to produce as much as they possibly can. Like if they can make more demand, they're going to produce more supply, right? And so the status goods have this weird situation where they want to limit the supply purposely because it's a status good. Okay. Now, I'm interested in how do you radically grow the digital economy. I think it could be a far more inclusive, far more wealth creating economy. And so I believe that for that to happen, people need to start producing things that use NFTs, but are not limited, like not trying to be status goods, but actually just goods, just digital goods that people use. I buy this t-shirt. It's a pretty generic t-shirt, but it's a special t-shirt. I love the way it fits. I've bought these t-shirts for years, and this company keeps producing those t-shirts. I'm going to keep using those t-shirts. And most of the economy works on these kinds of goods. And I think it's really, really important for And I think it's happening. It's just a matter of time, though. But artists will begin to understand that, hey, this is a radical new way to build a distribution channel to your collector, to your fan, that doesn't need to be intermediated, that you can decide what those rights should be, so people can experiment at the rights level. And the reason the rights are important is rights are how society organizes, right? So the idea of like, hey, let's give the artist a royalty, let's give the collector the public viewing rights, is that we should be able to organize differently. So by being able to operate at the rights level, and then by being able to have a digital borderless money, when you combine these two things together, so you have this digital good, you can pay for it with the digital money, the good can have embedded in it a different set of rights. You can, and the people producing that good can sell it directly without intermediation to the consumers. Man, like the size of that market for digital goods, not status goods, but digital goods, like I think it's got to be huge. And it'll take a while to get there, I'm sure. I don't think that will happen fast. But that's what I'm excited about. And I think that's what gets us out of this probably unhealthy spiral, which the NFTs are in now, where they're about the apes and they're about the punks, and nothing wrong with apes and punks. It's a cool project. But the status element, I like art a lot, because art has this sort of, art is both beauty and market. Like it's art and market, they're together in the same thing. And then there's also this patronage thing. So I've begun to support artists that I think are just like really great people, and they're doing great work, and anything that they make, I want to buy because I want to support them. Right. And I think that's a very short sort of, like, the adjacency to that would be, okay, could you organize people in a smaller community around, like you said, food production or drug development or any of these other activities that people are doing that can create value at a societal level that don't look like a status good. I think that's where the real innovations can come next. Yeah,
it's a really clear way to paint it. I tend to view, like when you think about a status good, the shadow form of it in this case would be like like a pyramid scheme, where I think of a pyramid scheme as like, it's like an echo in a closed room, where it's like, it's something that's trying to reach continual growth with finite resources. So I'm trying to continue to grow a stock with a limited number of investors. So I have to sell back the stock to invest to a limited supply pool. And it's almost like, I could think of this also as like in any discovery, anything that's really exciting for human beings, we race towards it because we all know that it's good. But then the racing outpaces the good in and of itself. So everyone's trying to get into the NFTs. We know there's something there, but then we kind of lose track of what the thing is that's valuable. And then it becomes about money again. It's like I'm buying and selling to a limited number of people. And so that the room, eventually the echo stops. Like you can't continue to sell the NFT to somebody else who's like, if the pool of people isn't growing quick enough to pace in the economic activity, then it's like a depression happens. But I view it as it's just a cycle along the bigger cycle. It's like a mechanism of feedback to let us know as a society how fast we should be moving. Because we have a tendency to move as fast as we possibly can. Sometimes we we move so fast that we outpace the actual meaningful progress that's being made.
These kind of boom and busts. They definitely rhyme. We see them again and again. I've thought deeply, like, is it possible to just have the boom and no bust? And I think it's just sort of human nature that when things start taking off and start to work, everybody wants on that train. When you realize that, that train's going to make a bunch of money, it's going to take you to a cool place, like you just want to hop on that train. And so perhaps this is just human nature, and we're going to have these booms and busts. And the hope is just that the majority of the investment flow, or not even the majority, the hope is that enough of the investment flows into the really good stuff, that after the bust, the good stuff has a chance to shine. I was talking with this guy who's a really famous producer, and he was saying that he's never been more excited about music NFTs. And I'm like, really? And he says, yes, because like all of the all the noise has been cleaned out. And now you get a chance to really make some good stuff. So like anytime that something becomes trendy, you kind of have to wait for the trend to run its course to be able to produce something that's good, that has craft, that will be timeless. And so it's about these kind of boom and busts. Yeah. So I just try to like strap on my seatbelt, not look at the price, you know, not think about, hey, is my money up or down? Just like, you know, 5 years, 10 years, like, am I excited about this technology to improve civilization 5 years out, 10 years out, and then just go work on that problem. Of course, you have to survive. You got to make enough money to survive. But I think like, at least for me personally, the more I can structure my environment, my friends, my team around long-term thinking, the easier it is to kind of weather the boom and bust. Because I mean, the boom and bust can get pretty dramatic. It's a strong whiptail, especially when you don't have a North Star, when you're not certain about these kind of conversations. At least for me, help me feel much more confident in the opinions that I do have, because someone like you will say, well, you know, maybe that's not quite right, or this is how it fits into something bigger. And I think if you just get into it quickly and you're like, oh my God, NFTs, got it. And your opinions are quick, they're not well thought out, then it's like, you know, it's not dissimilar from casting a poor vote in a democracy. It's like, well, if you don't think about something carefully, somebody has to put the work in somewhere along the line. And that's to me what it boils down to. And I think if you're on the tip of the spear of society in any particular value hierarchy, then the boom and bust cycle is like part of how we figure out where to go. You can avoid the whole thing by just getting into an industry that is past the boom and bust. Go extract gold from the ground today. Like, there's no boom and bust. It's like, yeah, there's some process for getting gold, and it's like some mining company, but it's like you're on the tip of the roller coaster for a reason. It's like so. Yeah, there is value being created. How much? It's hard to say. Who's going to get it? It's hard to say. Will it have a big impact? Again, very hard to say. But I think it would be a mistake to deny that there's a lot of value being created. I mean, whenever you see a whole bunch of really talented people piling into something new, and a lot of venture capitalists putting a lot of money into it, like, it's usually a matter of time. And so when you, like, the boom and bust is really because the market has no idea how to price this stuff. It's like people just get exuberant, or people get really pessimistic. And so that's the boom and bust. Over time, things will stabilize. Usually they do. And then there's probably some other market that's going to come up that people are going to be booming and busting in for a while. I think, I would like to argue that the Web3 and the crypto stuff is one of those real inflection points when it comes to how, like, tools that people have that can help them organize at much larger scale. So government is a tool that we use to organize at a certain scale, and I would like to hope and believe that this is a tool that we can use to organize at incredibly small scales and incredibly big scales. And I think that's the boom and bust comes along with that, because people will start organizing at different scales, and they'll bust, right? Different scales, different levels. But like, I guess my fear, the dark side that I take on this whole space is that the busts will be severe enough that the people won't be able to stomach them, and then they'll demand the regulation to come in and, hey, why can't you guys fix this? Like why can't we have the internet without the porn and without the malware? It's like, well, you can. It's an open internet. Like, it's the way it works. So like, hey, why can't we have the blockchain without the Bitcoin? Or why can't we have, the EVM without the ERC20 or the ERC721. It's like you'll hear this again and again. And my hope is that society doesn't clamp down on it, and people don't reject, like, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like, there's really, really bad stuff in crypto, and there's really, really amazing stuff in crypto.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
Where are you online? Are you active on Twitter? Are you doing anything public as far as writing or other things?
Yeah, like, this is a part of me that I'm really bad at. So I lived in Taiwan, and I was mainly operating in the Asia area. And I literally have not been back to the US in 17 years.
Damn.
So, like, I mean, I've been traveling back and forth, of course, but living in the US, I haven't been here for 17 years. So I don't have much of a social media presence. I'm not blogging much at all anymore. I love Twitter. Well, I hate Twitter. And yeah, no, I mean, this is something that I would, I'm hoping to make an effort. Like, part of the reason that when I saw your podcast, you guys reached out. I was looking into your podcast, thought it was so cool what you're doing, South America, and then here, and just trying to bridge different cultures, different regions. That's a theme that's really, really important to me. So I said right away, I'd love to talk with you. I mean, if you have any advice for me, but I want to be able to kind of meet more like-minded people, help out more with people trying to bridge different parts of the world. I think that's the real challenge for us moving forward, is how do we get past one country, and how do we live in a world where, more and more of the problems that we have to solve are together as a civilization. How do we do that? Yeah.
It was refreshing to talk to you. I mean, it feels crazy to say, but 2 hours flew by. Any particular people? Yeah.
Is it 2 hours? Oh, wow. Cool.
Any particular people or books or sources of inspiration stand out to you?
Yeah, right now it's really barbelled. So I'm reading a great book about Winston Churchill. So I'm reading more and more about history, mainly because I feel that, like you said, if you take the long-term view, if you step back far enough, so much of these things rhyme. And so I'm really trying to study history. So I've read a lot of books lately on history. So it's basically two things. It's books and then podcasts. And I mean, I got to admit, I'm just a huge fanboy of Elon Musk and what he's doing across so many different fronts. Like, I just take huge inspiration from that. And then huge inspiration from leaders like Churchill during times of like Churchill, like Abraham Lincoln. These are heroes of mine in time periods of just extreme social unrest. What do you do? Right? The pandemic was deeply disturbing to me personally. I thought my parents were going to die originally. I thought that, organizations like the CDC had their shit together, that, it's going to be fine. And then it's like, wow, emperor has no clothes. And you see this again and again, and it's just repeating everywhere. And so I look specifically to these leaders in times where their country is falling apart. How do you pull things together? And I try, for myself at least, to be that long-term force. In my own small team, we're just like 20-something people. So in that small team, like, can I be the long-term force when things around us are falling apart?
It's awesome, man. Yeah. That's awesome.
Those guys.
Well, I'll say, even though it may feel like a small team, one thing I've learned in my short life is that your actions ripple throughout other actors, other human beings. People think, okay, what would Sean do in this situation? Or other people that they embody, they think of as role models, and, just think how many different people they'll interact with. And, I think it's not just people who have a big social media following, but the real work of knowing people in your society, your community, it ripples like crazy. People dramatically, consistently underestimate the impact that their behavior has on society at large.